Becoming a monk or a nun in the Middle Ages was not a casual decision. It was a life-changing commitment, a choice that demanded devotion, discipline, and often sacrifice beyond imagination. Monastic life required leaving the world behind. Family, friends, wealth, and even personal desires were set aside. Young men and women entered monasteries or convents with the understanding that their entire existence would revolve around prayer, work, and obedience. The path began with discernment. For some, it was a calling felt deeply, a spiritual pull that could not be ignored. For others, it was a decision made by family, circumstance, or even social expectation. Noble families sometimes sent children to monasteries to secure alliances, manage inheritance, or ensure pious guidance. For the truly committed, the first step was the postulancy. A postulant was not yet a full member. They lived in the monastery or convent, observed routines, and learned the rules. This period tested their commitment. It could last months or even years. During this time, the aspirant learned discipline, silence, and humility. They observed the daily rhythm of monastic life: prayers, work, study, and meals. Physical labor was essential. Monks and nuns cultivated gardens, cleaned, cooked, and repaired buildings. Work was considered a form of devotion, a way to honor God through effort. The day was divided into fixed hours for prayer, called the Divine Office. From matins in the early hours of the morning to compline at night, every moment had purpose. Sleep was minimal. Meals were simple, often bread, vegetables, and water. Luxury was forbidden. Possessions were scarce, and personal items were limited to what was necessary. Clothing reflected this simplicity. Habits marked the novice as part of the community, a visible symbol of commitment and equality. The next stage was the novitiate. Novices took on more responsibility, learned scripture, memorized prayers, and were guided by senior monks or nuns. This period was still a trial. Leaving was always an option, but not easily taken. Vows had not yet been taken, but the sense of permanence was heavy. The novitiate instilled obedience. Every action, every word, and even every thought was observed and corrected. Moral guidance was strict. Mistakes were met with correction, sometimes harshly. Monastic life demanded internal transformation. The goal was to remove ego, pride, and attachment to worldly concerns. Education was part of the process. Reading scripture, learning prayers, and sometimes studying Latin were essential. For those in monasteries with libraries, copying manuscripts could be part of training. This work required patience, attention, and devotion. It was slow, repetitive, and sacred. The final step was taking vows. This formal commitment bound the individual to life in the monastery or convent. Poverty, chastity, and obedience were central. Once vows were taken, there was no turning back. Monks and nuns became part of the spiritual and social fabric of the church. They were responsible for prayer, education, hospitality, and the maintenance of their communities. Their lives became a living testament to devotion and discipline. After taking vows, life in the monastery or convent became total and unending devotion. The day began long before sunrise. Monks and nuns rose for matins, the first prayer of the day, often in darkness and silence. Their hours were filled with the divine office, repeated prayers, psalms, and readings. Every moment had structure. Every action was intentional. Even meals were ritualized. Eating was done in silence, often while listening to scripture or the reading of sacred texts. Physical labor remained central. Gardens, fields, kitchens, stables, and workshops required constant attention.
Work was not punishment, but spiritual practice. Each task, from tending animals to copying manuscripts, was an offering to God. For those in monasteries with scriptoria, copying books was an immense responsibility. A single error could invalidate a page, requiring painstaking correction. Illumination of manuscripts demanded incredible skill. Gold leaf, dyes, and intricate designs reflected devotion and artistry. Education continued throughout life. Reading, writing, and studying scripture were daily exercises. Some monks and nuns became scholars, teaching novices or even outside students. Hospitals, schools, and alms distribution fell under monastic care. Monks and nuns provided for travelers, the sick, and the poor, connecting their spiritual duties with practical service. Obedience remained a central requirement. The abbot or abbess wielded absolute authority within the walls of the monastery. Every monk and nun was accountable to this leadership. Disobedience was not taken lightly. Penances, fasting, or additional duties enforced discipline. Silence was enforced during much of the day, emphasizing reflection and mindfulness. Privacy did not exist. Communal living meant every word, every action, and even facial expressions were observed. The spiritual life demanded constant vigilance. Temptation, doubt, and worldly desire were to be resisted at all costs. Celibacy removed personal relationships, leaving one entirely devoted to God. Poverty required surrendering personal possessions, living minimally, and depending on the community for sustenance. Even thoughts were guided by discipline. Meditation, confession, and prayer shaped the mind and spirit. Despite restrictions, life in a monastery or convent offered unique freedoms. Monks and nuns were not subject to secular authorities. They were largely independent, protected by the Church. They could devote themselves entirely to spiritual and intellectual pursuits. Some became influential advisors, scholars, and teachers. Some wrote chronicles that preserved history for generations. Some influenced politics and diplomacy indirectly through correspondence and counsel. Yet life was not easy. Illness, injury, and hard labor were constant. The long hours, strict rules, and minimal comfort tested endurance. Many did not survive the rigors of monastic life. Those who persisted cultivated extraordinary patience, resilience, and focus. The community created support, but also pressure. Hierarchy within the monastery ensured that novices learned obedience and humility. The elderly or experienced monks and nuns guided the young, teaching skills, wisdom, and devotion. Death and illness were always close companions. Burials, funerals, and memorial prayers reminded all of mortality. Even in their deaths, monks and nuns contributed to spiritual life, being remembered in prayers and chronicles. Some monasteries and convents became centers of art, learning, and medicine. They preserved knowledge through copying books, studying herbs, and maintaining medical practices. Without these communities, much of medieval culture and science would have been lost. Monastic life demanded sacrifice, but it also offered a purpose that few outside could understand. It was a life fully dedicated to a higher goal,
structured by discipline, faith, and service. Becoming a monk or nun was not simply joining a religious institution. It was a transformation of mind, body, and soul. Those who embraced it lived differently than anyone else in the medieval world. They accepted a life without personal wealth, without marriage, without worldly ambition. Yet in doing so, they gained spiritual authority, knowledge, and a place within a community that shaped culture, religion, and education for centuries. Medieval monks and nuns were more than religious figures. They were preservers of knowledge, teachers, caregivers, and examples of human endurance. Their lives were rigorous, disciplined, and at times harsh, but also meaningful beyond measure. And for those who completed the path, there was a sense of permanence. Their actions, prayers, and work echoed far beyond their individual lives. In the Middle Ages, becoming a monk or nun was a journey that required courage, devotion, and an extraordinary commitment to a life entirely devoted to God and the service of others. It was one of the most demanding, yet revered paths a person could choose.